in some corners of the internet, I think, dating apps are sort of becoming maybe cultural punching bags might be a little strong, but
what was the expression?
That sort of dating apps are becoming cultural punching bags for a certain, younger Gen Z, for Gen Z folks. And, it's not always the coolest thing to meet your partner on the app. So despite your sort of the successful business story right now for Hinge, how are you thinking about navigating those cultural headwinds?
Yeah, I mean, for those who haven't been on a dating app in a while, I also met my husband on Match.com before dating apps were mobile, which dates me. But yeah, the category is struggling right now and has been for quite some time. And really at the core of that is a collection of apps that haven't necessarily been innovating their product and designing around a young audience. Hinge is a bit of an anomaly in the category where we've been growing double digit for a number of years. We're extraordinarily healthy in our growth. And it's because we've been singularly focused on the outcomes of daters. So you may have heard the expression, the dating app designed to be deleted. And what actually is behind that is a very principle, mission-driven organization that's designing to get people off of the app and into a great date. Mm-hmm. And that's what we measure. So we follow up via survey and we ask, did you go on a date? And if people say yes, we say, do you want to go on a second date? And if they say yes, that's a check. That was a great date. So when you're really focused on the outcome of the humans using your product experience, you will be more successful. And the organic momentum that comes when people talk about meeting their partners on Hinge begets growth. So we always sort of talk about when daters are successful, our business is successful. And we've seen that through and through. It's a very pure business model.
Yeah, you've mentioned that the second date rate is your North Star metric. What is your average second date rate these days? Do you have something like that?
We don't quite look at it in that way. We have 15 million users around the world. We recently launched in Latin America. So we entered Brazil and Mexico late last year. And, as our monthly active users grow, that number grows. And we look at across the entire dating journey, like how many people complete their profile. So Hinge, anyone in here has ever been through the Hinge app experience? Okay. So Hinge is, and I mean, anecdotally, I have met so many people here who have met their partners on Hinge, or I just met a woman who was just introduced to her daughter's boyfriend who they met on Hinge. But Hinge, along the journey, we have a pretty long onboarding. We ask for more questions. We ask for you to fill out prompts. These are little icebreaker questions. And we really are trying to get more information from each person so you can represent yourself in a more credible way. And it's not an app where you can move past one entire profile. Really what it is about modules of content on a profile that people can engage with. And we encourage you to both just send a signal, a like to someone on a piece of content, and also follow up with a comment. So the entire experience is really oriented around building momentum to conversations. We actually limit the number of conversations you can be having at any one time because we don't want you to collect conversations, and then encouraging people to exchange information and get off on the app, and then we follow up with them.
So obviously, yeah. So you mentioned these features that signal date readiness. You want to get people off of the app. You were CMO for 5 years, but you've obviously been part of conversations. You're basically a sort of creating the conditions for your own churn. So at the beginning of sort of this strategy, what were the kinds of conversations? Were you convincing investors or other folks at the how did you approach that? Before
yeah,
you had the data?
Not only creating our looking for churn, but even our onboarding. 20% of people don't make it through that hefty onboarding, and we're fine with that because we're trying to create a community and an environment of people who are highly intentioned daters looking for a partner. And so the ecosystem of the community is really important to us. I think, I get asked the question a lot because it feels so unusual, but the proof is in the pudding. We are growing enormously in every market because we're delivering success for daters on the app.
Yeah, of course. Um, you know, uh, we talked a little bit about this before this conversation. I anecdotally have talked to a number of folks who have tried to sort of game their profile in different ways by deleting their profile or pausing it. And is there any sort of product, reason why folks getting back on the app would have better success? We talked a little bit about maybe it has to do with the mentality of someone that might be choosing to sort of refresh their profile. And what does that say, I think, specifically about Gen Z, who are the majority of your users?
Yeah, over half of our monthly active users represent Gen Z. And I will say, working in this space is pretty profound because you're reminded both about the importance of relationships in our lives. There is a deep desire for finding partnership. And you're also reminded of how acutely hard it is. And by the way, we're living in an era where, we talk about this generation spending 1,000 less hours in person per year. That's like 2+ hours per day than 2 decades before them at the same age group. So they're spending more time in devices. So they're not as comfortable showing up in person with others. And this is the group that we're sort of welcoming into our Hinge experience. Mm-hmm. And so, in answer to your question, dating is really challenging. It's never not been, and it's a very vulnerable space. And we do see people take a break, and we kind of encourage that when you need that moment. And when you come back on, oftentimes people come back on at a different time in their life, in a different mindset, ready to sort of take it on again. So you see differences in how they fill out their profile for the second time and things like that. I think actually the biggest insight that we've been building against most recently is the feeling, particularly from women, that they are putting so much disproportionate amounts of effort into building their profile and doing the work, the emotional labor, I think, like in dating and in life, if I may add, and not necessarily seeing that reciprocated. So we just recently launched a feature called Signals that starts to give badges to daters on Hinge who are showcasing signals of thoughtfulness and effort. And it's things like having a rich profile or looking at someone's whole profile before you send them a like or a comment. It's a variety of things that we know signal you're actually putting some of the work in. And that has been a real unlock, not just for our female audience, but really for everyone in how, what it means to be engaging in a dating app and to do that in a way that's respectful.
Does it feel like I've talked to some folks who've been on as Signal, I've launched Signals, and does it feel a bit, because you can lose the badge too, you can sort of earn it and lose it if you're not engaging in the right way. I wonder if it feels like there's a sort of like gamifying accountability or something. Like, does it feel perhaps like another, I don't know, attention, you're trying to sort of grab people to sort of stay on the app at all? Or like, have you received any feedback like that? Because I do have folks that, have said they don't understand why they don't have a badge and they really want to get the badge, as opposed to thinking about, well, like, how are you speaking with people on the app, or how are you, thinking about the people you're reaching out to?
Not as much, no.
Okay.
What we have seen are things like one of the indicators of getting a signal is going through face check, which is basically a liveness check that you are the human that is using your Hinge profile. And that's actually been, Signals has been a driver in people completing face check, which is something that female users care deeply about, knowing that this is an actual person. This is the person whose profile I'm looking at. So we're seeing a lot of success and people actually appreciating that signal is being returned.
Got it. So yeah, it's encouraging folks to really.
It's really encouraging folks.
Yeah. So you mentioned sort of facial identification. We're sort of talking a little about AI. Obviously, we have to talk a little more about AI. Has improvements in AI affected the algorithm, just like the base sort of matching algorithm? How has it changed in the past year, 2 years?
Yeah, I mean, AI is obviously profound. Everybody's talking about it everywhere. And I think, as a society, we're scratching the surface on what role this technology will play in our lives and in our future. And at Hinge, we use AI generally in three ways. We use it to fuel our trust and safety tooling, which is huge. It allows us to monitor things like language, so we can send someone a message like, "Are you sure you want to send this?" Just to give people a gut check, or "Did this message bother you?" To kind of get that from the receiving end. That absolutely helps build our systems to be smarter. We're using it, as you mentioned, in the recommender. Technically speaking, any recommender is AI. So we've been using a recommender since the beginning. And I'll say that AI allows us to test and innovate on the models that we're using with profound speed. And just the test and learn of building product and putting product out there, prototyping product and learning from product from users and test is really incredible. And then the third way, of course, there are some tools throughout the journey where we offer AI should a user want to use it. For example, to build out a richer profile prompt. And the AI prompt feedback will basically ask you questions for you to answer. AI never replaces the human. AI supports you by prompting more questions for you to sort of share more of
So
who
it doesn't
you are in your
write
own
anything.
words.
Is it suggested
No.
text, not like the
Yeah,
Gmail?
for example, someone who I was talking to this morning was filling out a profile in front of me, which happens a lot. And they were talking about how they love to read. And I was like, great. And then, do you want to use AI prompts, prompt feedback? And she said, yes. And so we were kind of working through the prompt feedback real time. And it's like, what kind of books do you read? What's your favorite book? It's basically helping you tell more details, because at the end of the day, your prompt is supposed to be an icebreaker for someone else to engage with you in a way that's a bit more profound than what we see a lot, like, hey, what's up? What's up? And then, so it's giving you a little bit more about yourself to kind of lean in with a like and an actual comment, because again, we're trying to drive momentum, and that first conversational surface is really important.
Yeah.
So that's a third way that we use AI in the product, should people need a little bit more support in what to do in a certain interface.
Yeah. Speaking of supporting what to do, and the goal being to get folks off of the app, two questions. Have you ever thought, this just occurred to me this morning actually, about sort of integrating other services, like a reservation, for instance, service, or something that prompts actual date ideas? Because I think that, especially for Gen Z, that, as you mentioned, have a bit of trouble sort of thinking about the IRL experience and sort of where to go from there, might benefit.
Yeah, I mean, a couple things that we do. We recently launched a feature called Date Ideas, and that really is just allowing you to signal that you're there to go on dates, which everyone is there to go on dates, but putting it front and center in that way gives a little bit of a lower barrier for someone else to lean into actually asking you on a date. And that's just a module you can put onto your profile and customize when you want to go and some date ideas. And there are things like go for a walk, grab a coffee, and people can fill in what
But
they
not
want.
like an open table module.
But not an open table module. And part of the reason for that is, this is an audience that has Claude to do lots of planning activities for them, So I think one of the things that we do best, and one of the things that I encourage other folks building technology to do, is be really connected to your core audience, like truly understand what their needs are, and be able to look at that both through your own user research, but also people who are not using your product, also to be able to look at a high cultural altitude of where the world is going and how you can better serve this particular audience. We serve Gen Z, so we talk a lot about gender fluidity and how relationships and dating are completely changing and how do we build for that experience. And then we stay focused. We've been focused on building an app that encourages people to get off on dates since the very beginning. And so in many ways, like the focus stays the same, the core audience generally is changing, all the time. And so we're trying to stay relevant to them. And then we focus on product development against that. And we don't get distracted with the things that they can use some other platform for.
You mentioned when we did a prep call, moving into new markets and some interesting insights around sort of Gen Z that actually aren't geography specific or country specific like we've seen in other generations. And you mentioned sort of gender fluidity, but could you talk a little bit about some of like what are you seeing?
Yeah. So Hinge is, when I joined the organization 5 years ago, Hinge was in English speaking markets. And my role coming in, I've sat at the intersection of global brands and connection and technology, Coca-Cola, Spotify, those of the like. And the goal was to launch in Europe and start to build the foundation for a product that could serve more people in more places, and also to make that leap into Gen Z. So today we are like overrepresented by Gen Z as monthly active users. We've launched in Europe and we're the number one or number two dating app in every market. And we launched in Brazil and Mexico late last year. And so we're just in the early stages there. But the specific example you were talking about is, yes, Gen Z around the world is feeling a level of isolation and loneliness. Their peak dating years for experimentation happened in their late teens, early 20s when they were locked down in a pandemic. And it has had a disproportionate impact on how they approach romance and relationships. That is common all around the world, particularly in the metropolitan cities where Hinge is most often the number one dating app. And then underneath that, there are some really beautiful local cultural examples, because love and romance is a deeply cultural conversation with lots of signifiers that we see from how it shows up in history and celebrity culture and all the things. And in Brazil, which is always one of my favorite markets, we specifically see gender fluidity sort of in a further advanced explorative stage than even in the US. And we see things like ficantes, which is sort of a Portuguese word for situationship, but it's actually a sought after one, and you can have more than one, and you can go and have a dinner with someone and be in fecance with them and have a romantic evening, and that can be the end of it. And then you can go do that tomorrow with someone else, and it's sort of a celebrated awakening of that sort of courtship with a
True
lighter
dating in the sort of historical sense.
True dating in the sense of what maybe at some phase in life it once was.
Yeah. And you've also talked about how more women are identifying as bisexual.
Yeah, I mean, we're designing for next generation audiences. So within the LGBTQIA plus umbrella, the largest growth is coming from the B in bisexual, and it's largely young women who may or may not have been in an intimate romantic relationship, but this is a sense of identity. And so we're also building for, the developing identity as you go through a dating app and a relationship experience. You're both building a relationship with someone else. You're also growing and changing as a person. And so that identity sort of unfolding is something that we're building for as well.
And question. So you have you've talked about the free services. Oh, also I should mention I'm going to come to audience questions in after this. So get your questions ready. You've described your free services as sacred, and you will have 15% paid, right? I believe are most of that 15% men? Does it break down by gender or by any other differentiator?
Yeah, so about less than 15%
Okay.
of users on Hinge are paying subscribers.
Yeah.
And, for us, gender balance is a really important thing in our community. You can kind of feel that in the community itself. Within the folks who are paying, there is a larger majority of payers who are men. But there are a number of tools that sort of everyone uses, So
Like roses?
yeah, I mean, roses is
Yeah.
is incredible. It's one of those tools on Hinge that signifies really high intent, and free users are given a rose, every week. And I hear so many stories from women who said, "I didn't really want to send a rose, but I decided to send a rose, and actually, I am now in a relationship with that person."
So it bears out in the metrics because I have heard
It
from people
does.
that they worry, and this is, a deeply sexist, I think, feeling, but that if they're, as a woman sending a rose, it feels desperate.
Well, we know that people who send roses go on twice as many dates. So if you're there to date and you want to signify that,
Roses is a great place to start.
it could be.
Okay. Any audience questions? I have a lightning round, but I will start with.
So your product's pretty unique because your goal is to basically have no repeat business. So do you guys have a corporate strategy, cross-brand strategy across the Match portfolio? You start with Tinder, you move to Hinge, and maybe something else later?
No, I mean, what's really interesting is that I think when everyone looks at the category and they see many, many dating apps that are either flat or on decline and one outlier, it's because we're focused on outcomes. And if you actually look at the addressable market of people looking to be in relationship with someone else, the growth opportunity is seismic. So actually what we have seen is pretty much all apps over the past year and a half or so are sort of now talking about outcomes of getting people off the app and into dates, or off the app and to an event, And so really the way the Match Group portfolio is who is your core audience and what are you building for them? Hinge is and will always be an app that's built for a highly intentioned dater looking for an individual.
So I had just a quick question. So you were CMO and then became CEO.
Yes.
And what was the biggest difference, or what do you see as the biggest difference? Because oftentimes you're having, discussions with the CFO, and now the conversations are completely different. So I'm very curious in terms of what was the transition like, and what were the challenges and the positives?
Yeah, so when I joined Hinge, similar to when I joined Spotify, the business was much smaller and it was founder led. And so I think, what marketers bring to an organization most often is an acute understanding of culture, of how to leverage creativity, and of their core audience. And I think the magic is when you can rally a whole organization to be building for that person. And so I always had sort of a outsized voice at Hinge. It's a fairly small team. And my goal when I came in was to move the business into Europe and move the business closer to the next generation of daters, which is such an awesome challenge, right? It's a very human category and Hinge is a very mission-driven business. And so in doing that work, you just build an enormous amount of credibility with the teams building product, the finance teams who are seeing the results. You are sort of bringing everybody along the journey and making bets and things that don't necessarily feel perfect or like they've been done before on paper. But, I even look at this business model of building to get people off the app, which people think is, the way to build a product that declines. No, it's a way to build a product that works. Mm-hmm. And if your product is working, you almost don't need marketing, right? Especially when it's in the relation space and everybody is looking for partnerships. So I think it was quite natural for me. I actually made a transition about a year before our founder left into a president CMO role. And then our founder stepped out of the business. He really wanted to go back to sort of like a building from the beginning 0 to 1 thing. And then I naturally sort of stepped in. And I think probably the biggest difference is I have to recognize the power of my voice in rooms. I really believe in a more distributed leadership style. So people closest to the problems, closest to the teams, closest to the work, making recommendations and making decisions, and kind of moving product teams to move with more momentum, which is kind of everything you need in a product tech business. So it's been a fun transition.
I think
But I get asked the question a lot, especially here at
Yeah,
Can.
of course. I think we have time for one question, if we can keep it short.
Oh, sorry. So, former Hinge user here. So, thank you.
Oh.
Add to your anecdotal. And also, I've been told to say you're doing God's work.
I don't know about that. I think, I think to find yourself in a role where you get to have this sort of impact, not on everyone, but on a number of people, is pretty cool.
My very quick question is, you guys are doing such a great job bringing people together in a romantic way. Has there been a thought to do that more in a social way, where you know that there's an epidemic of loneliness that's happening everywhere?
Yes. I mean, we talk about it all the time. So 4 years ago when I joined, we kicked off a social impact program we call One More Hour. And One More Hour is built off the insight I shared earlier of less hours spent in person. And it is built to encourage just one more hour spent in person. And we do work by making a large volume of micro grants to mostly Gen Z founded social clubs and groups. So in New York, that's Reading Rhythm. In LA, that's Intersection Surf. So we're basically sort of spreading money to organizations that are trying to start up on their own to convene. And it really has nothing to do with dating or romance. It's just about building back or building some resilience and wanting to get out of the house and meet up with other people, because we know that ultimately helps our business, because it's a very high bar to go meet someone for a date.